A grandmother in rural Tennessee stands in the parking lot of what used to be First Baptist Church. The building sold last year to a fitness center. She remembers when this parking lot was full every Sunday, when you couldn't find a seat without arriving 30 minutes early. Now she drives 20 miles to the nearest church that still has a full-time pastor. She's not alone in this experience, and what's happening around her tells a story that most Americans don't realize is unfolding right beneath their noses. There's a map that demographers, researchers, and religious organizations have been quietly updating for the past 2 decades. It's not shown on the evening news, it doesn't trend on social media, but it reveals something extraordinary. The Bible Belt, that swath of deeply religious territory stretching from Texas through the Deep South and up into parts of Appalachia, is experiencing the most dramatic religious transformation in American history. Not slowly, not gradually. We're talking about a collapse happening in real time, measured in shuttered churches, empty pews, and a generation that's walking away from the faith their great-grandparents would have died to protect. Let me show you what the data actually says because the numbers are staggering. In 1972, the General Social Survey found that 63% of Americans in southern states attended church at least once a month. By 2021, that number had plummeted to 45%. But here's where it gets interesting. That's just the average. When you break it down by age, the picture becomes even more dramatic. Among Southerners under 35, regular church attendance has fallen to just 28%. We're not talking about a gentle decline. We're witnessing a statistical cliff. The Southern Baptist Convention provides even more specific evidence. In 2006, they reported 16.3 million members. By 2022, that number had dropped to 13.7 million, a loss of 2.6 million people, and this is in a region where the population actually grew by millions during the same period. The denomination is hemorrhaging members at a rate of roughly 3,000 people per week. Read that again. 3,000 people per week, leaving the largest Protestant denomination in America, most of them concentrated in its traditional heartland. But raw numbers only tell part of the story. What's happening on the ground is even more revealing. Rural churches across the South are dying at an unprecedented rate. A study by the Hartford Institute for Religion Research found that approximately 100 to 200 churches close their doors every week in America, with a disproportionate number located in southern and rural areas. These aren't small storefront churches. These are institutions that have stood for generations, buildings that served as the social and moral centers of their communities. Drive through any small town in Alabama, Mississippi, or Arkansas, and you'll see them. Empty church buildings with fading paint and overgrown parking lots. Some have been converted into antique stores or community centers. Others just sit vacant, windows broken, hymnals molding in the humid air. Each one represents not just a religious institution, but the collapse of a social infrastructure that defined Southern life for more than a century. Welcome to Professor Archive, where we dig into the stories and data that reveal how our world is really changing. If you've been enjoying these deep dives into the patterns reshaping our society, consider leaving a super thanks. It directly supports the research that makes these videos possible. Now, I'm curious, where are you watching this from? And more specifically, if you're in the South, what are you seeing in your own community? Drop a comment with your location and what time it is where you are. I want to know if what I'm describing matches what you're witnessing firsthand. The question everyone asks at this point is simple. Why? Why is this happening now? And why is it happening so dramatically in the very region that defined itself through religious devotion? The answer isn't simple, but it's traceable through multiple converging forces that have fundamentally altered Southern culture. Start with education. The South has experienced an education boom over the past 30 years. College attendance among Southern youth increased by 47% between 1990 and 2020. Universities expanded throughout the region. Community colleges multiplied. And here's what researchers have consistently found. There's a strong inverse correlation between educational attainment and religious participation. The Pew Research Center has documented this extensively. Among Americans with a high school education or less, 54% attend religious services regularly. Among those with postgraduate degrees, that number drops to 46%. The gap might not seem enormous, but it's consistent and it's growing. But education alone doesn't explain the speed of the change. The internet does. Before the internet, questioning your faith in a small southern town meant genuine isolation. You were surrounded by believers, your doubts had nowhere to go, and alternative viewpoints were scarce. The internet changed everything. Suddenly, a teenager in rural Georgia could access arguments against Christianity, communities of former believers, and entire intellectual traditions that challenged everything they'd been taught. The monopoly on information that allowed Southern churches to dominate their communities simply evaporated. Ryan Burge, a political scientist and Baptist pastor who studies religious trends, has noted something fascinating in his data. The decline in Southern religiosity almost perfectly tracks the expansion of broadband internet access. It's not causation exactly, but the correlation is remarkable. Communities got online and church attendance dropped. The timeline is undeniable. Then there's the political factor, and this is where things get controversial. The fusion of evangelical Christianity with conservative politics, which seemed like a masterstroke in the 1980s and 1990s, has become a liability. Younger Southerners increasingly see the church not as a spiritual institution, but as a political one, and not one they agree with. According to a 2019 survey by the Public Religion Research Institute, 40% of Americans who left their childhood religion cited negative teachings about or treatment of LGBTQ people as an important factor. In the South, where churches have been most vocal on these issues, the exodus has been most pronounced. Here's a specific example that illustrates this perfectly. In 2015, after the Supreme Court legalized same-sex marriage, many Southern pastors became even more outspoken against LGBTQ rights. They expected their congregations to rally around them. Instead, they found empty pews. Young people, even those who grew up in deeply religious households, simply stopped coming. They didn't argue. They didn't protest. They just left. Quietly. Permanently. The economic transformation of the South has played a role too. For most of Southern history, communities were stable. Families stayed in the same towns for generations. Your grandfather's church was your father's church was your church. But economic changes brought mobility. Young people leave for jobs in Atlanta, Charlotte, Nashville, and Austin. They leave for education and never come back. The social pressure that kept people in church pews requires physical presence in a community, and that presence is dissolving. Look at the data on interstate migration. Between 2010 and 2020, Mississippi lost 0.2% of its population to outmigration. Alabama lost 1.1%. Arkansas lost 1.8%. These might seem like small percentages, but they represent the youngest and most educated cohorts leaving rural and small-town areas for cities. And when they get to those cities, even cities in the South, they don't go back to church. Nashville, supposedly the buckle of the Bible Belt, now has a church attendance rate barely higher than the national average. Atlanta is functionally secular by Bible Belt standards. But perhaps the most underreported factor is simply scandal and hypocrisy. The Southern Baptist Convention has been rocked by revelations of widespread sexual abuse cover-ups. An independent investigation released in 2022 found that denominational leaders maintained a secret list of credibly accused abusers and did nothing to stop them. We're talking about hundreds of cases spanning decades. For people who were told their entire lives that the church represented moral authority, these revelations have been devastating. And it's not just the Baptists. Megachurch scandals have dominated headlines. Pastors with private jets preaching prosperity gospel while their congregants struggle with medical debt. High-profile moral failures, affairs, embezzlement, abuse of power. Each scandal chips away at the credibility that churches once held. In previous generations, people overlooked these failures or explained them away. This generation doesn't. The cultural impact of this religious decline is enormous and barely discussed in mainstream media. For more than a century, Southern identity was inseparable from Christian identity. Being Southern meant being Christian, full stop. That's not true anymore, and the identity crisis this has created is profound. What does it mean to be Southern when the primary cultural marker of Southernness is disappearing? You can see this playing out in unexpected ways. Country music, once saturated with Christian themes, has become increasingly secular. Luke Bryan, one of the biggest country stars of the past decade, rarely mentions God or church. That would have been unthinkable for a mainstream country artist in 1995. Beer, trucks, and good times, sure, but you had to acknowledge Jesus. Not anymore. The market has changed because the audience has changed. Southern literature is experiencing the same shift. Writers from the South used to wrestle with faith as a central theme. Flannery O'Connor, Walker Percy, William Faulkner, all of them engaged deeply with Christianity and its role in Southern life. Contemporary Southern writers are more likely to write about the absence of faith or treat religion as background detail rather than central drama. The culture is secularizing in real time. The political implications are equally significant and largely unpredicted by analysts. The entire Republican strategy for the past 40 years has depended on the Bible Belt remaining exactly what its name suggests: deeply religious and reliably conservative. But if younger Southerners aren't going to church, aren't identifying as evangelical, and increasingly view religious institutions with skepticism or hostility, the political map could shift in ways that would have seemed impossible 20 years ago. Georgia flipping blue in 2020 wasn't just about demographic change from people moving to Atlanta. It was also about generational change among native Georgians. Young people raised in the church who no longer attend, who no longer identify primarily through their religious affiliation. This pattern is repeating across the South, just at different speeds in different states. North Carolina is perhaps the most visible example. 20 years ago, it was solidly red. Now it's a perpetual swing state, and the trend is toward blue. Virginia has already completed this transition, moving from reliably Republican to reliably Democratic in just 15 years. Tennessee and Texas are showing early signs of the same pattern. The common thread isn't just urbanization, it's secularization. But let's talk about what this means for the people actually living through it, because statistics don't capture the human dimension of this transformation. Imagine you're 60 years old, you've attended the same church your entire life, and suddenly it closes because there aren't enough young families to sustain it. The building where you were baptized, where you got married, where you buried your parents, it's gone. Sold to a developer or left to decay. That's not just a religious loss, it's an identity loss, a community loss, a sense that the world you knew and understood is simply ending. For younger people, it's different, but equally complex. Many describe a sense of liberation, of escaping communities and belief systems that felt constricting or judgmental. But they also describe loss. The loss of community, of shared ritual, of a ready-made social network. Churches provided those things, whatever you thought of their theology. Leaving means building new structures, new communities, and that's hard work with no guarantee of success. There are also people caught in the middle who still believe but feel alienated from the institutions that are supposed to represent their faith. They describe watching their churches become increasingly political, increasingly focused on culture war issues while ignoring poverty, inequality, and other concerns they consider more aligned with Jesus' actual teachings. Some of these people have left organized religion entirely. Others church hop, looking for communities that feel authentic, usually without success. The economic impact of church decline is another under-discussed dimension. Churches in the South haven't just been religious institutions. They've been economic engines. They employ people. They purchase goods and services. They maintain properties. They run daycares and schools. When a church closes, that's economic activity that disappears from a community, often a community that's already economically struggling. A 2016 study estimated that religious congregations contribute $1.2 trillion annually to the U.S. economy through various activities and services. As Southern churches decline and close, a meaningful chunk of that economic activity is vanishing from the very areas that can least afford to lose it. This creates a vicious cycle. Economic decline drives young people away, which accelerates church decline, which further damages the local economy. There's also a mental health dimension that researchers are only beginning to understand. Religious communities, whatever their flaws, provided social support networks. They checked on elderly members. They organized meals for families in crisis. They created space for people to gather and connect. As these institutions decline, who fills that role? In cities, there might be alternatives. In rural areas, often there aren't. Social isolation is increasing, and the decline of churches is part of that story. Some communities are trying to adapt. You'll find churches that have rebranded themselves, dropped denominational affiliations, created more casual worship styles, backed away from controversial political stances. These churches are sometimes successful at attracting younger members. But they're the exception, not the rule, and they often alienate older members in the process of trying to appeal to younger ones. The balancing act is nearly impossible. There are also demographic factors that accelerate decline in ways that are hard to reverse. Churches depend on children. Sunday school, youth groups, vacation Bible school. These weren't just religious education programs. They were recruitment tools. Families joined churches because they wanted their children involved. But birth rates in the South have been falling, just like everywhere else in America. Fewer children means fewer families with a reason to join churches, and the children who do grow up in churches are leaving at higher rates than any previous generation. The knowns, as researchers call them, people who identify with no religious tradition, were almost non-existent in the South 40 years ago. Now they represent roughly 25% of the population in southern states, and among young adults, that number exceeds 40% in most southern metro areas. These aren't people who are angry at religion or militantly atheist. Most describe themselves as spiritual but not religious. Or they simply say religion isn't relevant to their lives. They're indifferent, and indifference is far more dangerous to religious institutions than hostility. What makes this transformation particularly striking is the speed. The Catholic Church in Europe declined over centuries. The Church of England declined over generations. The Bible Belt is declining in decades, and in some metrics in years. This is sociological change at a pace that societies rarely experience outside of war or revolution. And yet most Americans, even those who live in affected communities, don't fully recognize what's happening because it's gradual enough to seem normal year by year, even as it's revolutionary decade by decade. The COVID-19 pandemic accelerated trends that were already in motion. Churches closed during lockdowns. People got used to not attending. When churches reopened, many people simply didn't return. Pastors across the South described the same experience. They expected 70%, maybe 80% of their congregation to come back. Instead, they got 40% or 50%. The people who didn't return weren't angry. They just realized they didn't miss it. The habit was broken, and once broken, it didn't reform. Streaming services also played a role. Churches that offered online services during the pandemic found that some members preferred watching from home. They could skip the songs they didn't like, turn it off if the sermon didn't engage them, avoid the social obligations that come with physical attendance. For people who were already marginal in their commitment, online church became no church at all within months. There's a generational memory aspect to this that's important to understand. For people born before 1960, church wasn't optional. It was what you did. It was socially mandatory, culturally expected, and economically necessary in many communities. Not attending church could affect your business, your social standing, your marriage prospects. That external pressure maintained high attendance rates even among people who weren't particularly devout. For people born after 1990, none of that is true. Church is completely optional. There's no social penalty for not attending. There's no economic consequence. Their friends don't go, their coworkers don't go. They can build full, successful lives without ever stepping inside a church. And overwhelmingly, that's exactly what they're doing. The data on belief itself is also shifting in ways that undermine religious institutions, even beyond attendance. A 2022 survey found that only 66% of Americans believe in the God of the Bible, down from 79% in 2011. In southern states, the decline has been even steeper because they started from higher baselines. When people stop believing in core doctrines, attendance becomes irrelevant. You can't revitalize an institution if the worldview it represents no longer resonates. There are also cultural memory issues. Entire communities in the South organize their social lives around church activities. Wednesday night dinners, Sunday evening services, revival weeks, vacation Bible school, church league softball. These created rhythms and relationships that defined community life. As churches decline, what replaces those rhythms? In most cases, nothing. People are more isolated, more atomized, connected online, but not in person. Some scholars argue this decline is part of a broader American trend, that the South is just catching up to secularization patterns that happened earlier in other regions. There's truth to that. The Pacific Northwest secularized decades ago. New England's church attendance has been low since the 1980s, but the difference is that those regions never defined themselves primarily through religious identity. The South did. Southern exceptionalism was largely religious exceptionalism. As that exceptionalism fades, what makes the South distinctly Southern? This is creating interesting cultural hybrids. Young Southerners who don't attend church but still identify culturally as Christian, who celebrate Christmas and Easter but couldn't tell you the last time they read the Bible, who might pray occasionally but would never join a congregation. This is nominal Christianity, and it's becoming the norm rather than the exception. It's a transitional state, and researchers suggest that the children of these nominal Christians will likely identify as knowns entirely, completing the secularization process. The infrastructure of Bible Belt Christianity is also aging in ways that make decline difficult to reverse. The average age of Southern Baptist pastors is now over 50. Seminaries are seeing declining enrollment. Fewer young people are entering ministry as a profession. The pipeline that sustained these institutions for generations is running dry. Even if there were a sudden revival of interest in church attendance, there wouldn't be enough trained leaders to accommodate it. Church buildings themselves are often liabilities now. Many were built in the 1950s and 1960s during the post-war boom. They require significant maintenance. Roofs leak. HVAC systems fail. Parking lots crack. For declining congregations with aging memberships, the cost of maintaining these buildings is prohibitive. They can't afford repairs. They can't afford updates to make the spaces appealing to younger visitors. The buildings themselves become symbols of decline, reinforcing the perception that these institutions belong to the past. Financial data tells a stark story. Average weekly giving per attendee at Southern churches has remained essentially flat when adjusted for inflation, but attendance is down 30% or more at many churches. That means revenue is down 30% while fixed costs like building maintenance, utilities, and pastoral salaries remain constant or increase. The math simply doesn't work. Churches are forced to cut programming, reduce staff, defer maintenance, all of which makes them less attractive to potential new members, creating another vicious cycle. In the past, denominational structures could support struggling churches. The Southern Baptist Convention, for instance, had systems for helping small rural churches stay afloat. But as the denomination itself shrinks, those support systems are weakening. The resources aren't there anymore. Churches are increasingly on their own, and most aren't viable as standalone institutions. Some communities are experiencing complete religious collapse. Towns where there were once 5 or 6 churches now have 1 or none. These aren't hypothetical scenarios. You can find specific examples throughout Mississippi, Arkansas, Louisiana, and rural parts of other southern states. Towns of 500 or 1,000 people with no functioning church for the first time in a century. The social and psychological impact of this is difficult to measure but undeniably significant. There's also a theological dimension to this decline that's important to consider. Many Southern churches preached a very specific form of Christianity that was resistant to questioning, skeptical of science, and insistent on biblical literalism. That worked when those churches had an information monopoly. It doesn't work when congregants can immediately Google apparent contradictions, historical context, or alternative interpretations. The theological inflexibility that once seemed like strength now appears as rigidity, and people are walking away. Compare this to Catholic churches or mainline Protestant churches that allowed more interpretive flexibility. They're also declining, but at slower rates and from different causes. The more rigid the doctrine, the faster the decline when that doctrine is challenged by broader cultural shifts. Southern evangelical churches staked everything on a particular interpretation, being not just true but obviously, undeniably, literally true. When that obviousness evaporated, the foundation crumbled. The political radicalization of Southern churches has particularly alienated women. Surveys show that young Southern women are leaving churches at higher rates than young Southern men. They're less likely to identify as evangelical, less likely to attend services, and more likely to describe themselves as spiritual but not religious. This is significant because women have historically been the backbone of church participation, more likely to attend, more likely to volunteer, more likely to bring children. When you lose women, you lose the institution. This brings us to a question that nobody seems to be asking publicly, but that's crucial to understanding what comes next. If the Bible Belt is falling apart, what replaces it? What fills the vacuum left by declining religious institutions? The honest answer is that we don't know yet because it's happening now, in real time, and the replacement structures haven't fully formed. Some people are finding community in other ways: hobby groups, online communities, political movements, wellness culture. But these are diffuse and individualized. They don't create the kind of cohesive community identity that churches once provided. Others are simply more isolated, less connected, navigating life without the institutional support structures their grandparents took for granted. There's also a real possibility that this decline isn't permanent. Religious affiliation in America has fluctuated before. The late 19th and early 20th centuries saw periods of decline followed by religious revivals. It's possible that a generation or two from now, there could be renewed interest in religious community. But if that happens, it almost certainly won't look like the Bible Belt Christianity of the 20th century. That specific cultural moment appears to be ending. What we're witnessing is the closing of a chapter in American history. The Bible Belt as a distinct region defined by overwhelming religious homogeneity and cultural conservatism tied to that religiosity, it's dissolving. Not disappearing entirely, but becoming something different. Less religious, more diverse, more similar to the rest of America. For people who loved what the Bible Belt represented, this is a tragedy. For people who felt constrained or harmed by it, this is liberation. For most people, it's probably some complicated mixture of both. The map they don't show on the news reveals a transformation as significant as any in American history. A region reinventing itself, shedding an identity it wore for generations, becoming something new. Whether that something new is better or worse depends entirely on who you ask and what you value. But make no mistake, it's happening. The churches are closing, the pews are empty, the Bible Belt is falling apart. And here's what might be the most important thing to understand. This isn't about whether Christianity is true or false, good or bad. This is about social change, cultural transformation, the way communities and regions evolve over time in response to economic, technological, and demographic pressures. The Bible Belt was a specific historical phenomenon created by specific conditions, and those conditions are changing. The result is inevitable. Thanks for watching Professor Archive. If you found this exploration valuable, if it gave you a new perspective on changes happening around us, consider supporting the channel with a super thanks. These deep research dives take considerable time and resources, and your support makes them possible. And don't forget to share your observations in the comments. What are you seeing where you live? Are these patterns playing out in your community? Let's continue this conversation.